Okay, we're going to get into chapter 3. I just wanted to point out to you what my book looks like. I think you'll notice that this is probably a much bigger book than what you're using in class. This is the cover of the book I purchased, and I purchased this just because most students have very small paperbacks, and it's difficult to see annotations on there. I mean, even this, there's not a ton of room to write. But it's also easier to read something a little bit larger instead of a super small, cramped font. So just in terms of you keeping up with me, I would just focus on, what is the first sentence in each paragraph in order to track with my page numbers. So like the first chapter we saw, this chapter also begins with a reflection by Charles Dickens himself. And a lot of the chapters in Tale of Two Cities begin with the narrator, Charles Dickens, giving us some background or setting the scene or making some historical connection. And this particular paragraph is interesting. It's different from the others because Dickens uses the first person I. And by doing so, he creates intimacy or connection between himself and us. It does create more of a timeless feel. We do feel like his world is the same as our world when he directly uses the word I instead of just third person. And I just want to read a little bit of this to you. A wonderful fact to reflect upon, that every human creature is constituted to be that profound secret and mystery to every other. A solemn consideration when I enter a great city by night, that every one of those darkly clustered houses encloses its own secret, that every room and every one of them encloses its own secret, that every beating heart in the hundreds of thousands of breasts there is, in some of its imaginings, a secret to the heart nearest it. So we have repetition again of secrets. Secrets is a motif that helps us sort of connect to the main theme of the book. But he's creating here sort of a universality of death. The fact that death is inevitable and that everyone at some point is going to have their lives just end without their expecting it. And he says here, I have had glimpses of buried treasure and other things submerged. It was appointed that this book should shut with a spring forever and forever when I had read but a page. It was appointed that the water should be locked in an eternal frost when the light was playing on its surface and I stood in ignorance on the shore, meaning that our life as we know it could suddenly stop, and that even the people we're closest to have things in their heart that nobody else knows. And this is very much true even today. And I think this is an interesting sort of just reflection that he makes here. So then he pivots into the present time, which is again the mail going to Dover with Mr. Lorry inside, and Jerry, who is the messenger from Tellson's Bank, is riding back to London. And this is a really short chapter, pretty much just gives us some characterization of Jerry. These are the kind of things that might show up on a quiz. As he's heading back to London, he stops at all the pubs and gets a drink. But just like the people in the mail carriage, he is secretive. He keeps his head covered with a hat. He keeps himself wrapped up in his coat. There's description here of his physical features. He has eyes that are have a tendency of being very close together. They're very black with no depth of color in them. They have a sinister expression. These are questions that might be on a reading quiz. And he talks here about, to himself really, about, what was that again that Mr. Lorry said about being recalled to life, and how it wouldn't suit his line of business if people were recalled to life. So again, we're getting a teaser here about what exactly is his line of business. Then it describes his hair. This is kind of a funny description. Except on the crown, which was raggedly bald, he had stiff black hair standing jaggedly all over it and growing downhill almost to his broad, blunt nose. So it's sticking up and it's flopping over his face. It was so like Smith's work, so much more like it. and the top of a strongly spiked wall than a head of hair, that the best of players at leapfrog might have declined him as the most dangerous man in the world to go over. So this is just a joke that his hair stuck up so fast that if you were playing leapfrog, you couldn't jump over him. So he's going to go back to Temple Bar, which, just a reminder, that's the gate, sort of the stone entrance to the financial district, and deliver this message, recalled to life, to the person who's sitting at the watchman of the bank. Then there's just a description here about Tellson's Bank, that Tellson Bank had a run upon it in the mail. And what that means is that people want their money out. There's just more bank business going on during this time. As the bank passenger with the arm drawn through the leathern strap, which did what lay in it to keep him from pounding against the next passenger and driving him into his corner, whenever the coach got a special jolt, nodded in his place with half-shut eyes, the little coach windows and the coach lamp dimly gleaming through them, and the bulky bundle of opposite passenger became the bank and did a great stroke of business. So this is describing Mr. Lorry again. He's in the carriage. He's holding important bank documents. He's keeping himself away from the other passengers. And he's dreaming here a little bit. He's dozing off to sleep because it's the middle of the night. And he's thinking about the strong rooms underground at Tellson's with their valuable stores and secrets. So there's secrets again, as were known to the passenger, and it was not little that he knew about them, opened before him, and he went in among them with great keys and the feeble burning candle, and found them safe and strong and sound and still, just as he had last seen them. So Mr. Lorry is a keeper of secrets. He takes care of people's money, and he takes care of people's possessions and trusts. People, if they have inheritances and things like that, he takes care of that. And so he sees himself as somebody very important in the eyes of the bank and of the banking public. And then he continues sort of in his half dreams, remembering that he is on his way to dig someone out of a grave. And he keeps imagining faces of a 45-year-old man who is the person he's supposed to be digging out of the grave, trying to imagine what they might look like. So he just sees images of this person as he's dreaming. And he keeps asking himself this question over and over. He imagines himself talking with the man he's going to rescue, where he would ask him, "Buried how long?" And the answer would be, "Almost 18 years. You had abandoned all hope of being dug out long ago. You know that you are recalled to life? They tell me so. I hope you care to live. I can't say. Shall I show her to you? Will you come and see her?" Well, this is the first we've had any kind of reference to a her. Who is he talking about here? We're going to find out. So just remember, you're going to encounter all kinds of things in this story that have unanswered questions for you as a reader, but you will find out. So the answer to this question was various and contradictory. Sometimes the broken reply was, "Wait, it would kill me if I saw her too soon." Other times, "I don't know her, I don't understand," or "take me to her." So Mr. Lorry is imagining that the person he's going to go help is going to be conflicted in whether or not he wants to see her, whoever her is. After such imaginary discourse, the passenger in his fancy would dig and dig and dig, now with a spade, now with a great key, now with his hands, to dig this wretched creature out. So again, we have this reference to digging someone out of a grave, that he's going to save somebody from, being trapped underground, apparently. And here we have the repetition again of how long? 18 years. I hope you care to live. I can't say. Dig, dig, dig. So this is how the night passes for Mr. Lorry in the carriage, and soon the sun comes up. So they have traveled to Dover through the night. Daybreak is coming, and with daybreak comes hope. Mr. Lorry lowered the window and looked out at the rising sun. There was a ridge of plowed land with a plow upon it where it had been left last night, when the horses were unyoked, beyond a quiet coppice wood in which many leaves of burning red and yellow still remained upon the trees. Though the earth was cold and wet, the sky was clear, and the sun rose bright, placid, and beautiful. 18 years, said the passenger, looking at the sun. Gracious creator of day, to be buried alive for 18 years. So this is a moment of hope, of the possibility that the person he's going to help will be okay. So the next chapter, chapter 4, is the preparation. So this is where the plot really gets going. Right at the beginning, it says, when the mail got to Dover in the course of the forenoon, which would be like in the morning, like before lunch, the head drawer of the Royal George Hotel opened the coach door as his custom was. Okay, so a head drawer is a bellman. That's someone who takes your luggage when you arrive at a hotel. The Royal George is where he is staying. That might be a quiz question. It also tells us that this journey was undertaken in the winter. So, winters in England are not like winters in parts of the United States with snow and ice. It's more sloppy, sleet, rain, and cold, temperatures in the 30s and 40s, which explains why the horses had such a hard time getting up Shooter's Hill, because it was so muddy and wet. So chilly, very chilly. It describes the inside of the coach. This is a great description. I mean, this is so typically Dickens. The mildewy inside of the coach, with its damp and dirty straw, its disagreeable smell, and its obscurity, was rather like a larger dog kennel. Mr. Lorry, with the passenger, shaking himself out of it in chains of straw, a tangle of shaggy wrapper, flapping hat, and muddy leg, was rather like a larger sort of dog. He asks the bellman, or the head drawer, if there will be a packet to Calais tomorrow. So that means a boat. A packet would be like a boat taking the mail to France, and Calais is the small town on the other side of this, across the shore, or across the water. And he says yes, if the weather holds. So as long as it's not too stormy or wavy, they will have a boat going, taking the mail, and of course, Mr. Lorry and his companion. And he asked Mr. Lorry if he would like to go to bed, because perhaps he's exhausted. And Mr. Lorry says, no, I will not go to bed until nighttime, but I do want a bedroom and a barber. So he's going to get himself freshened up. And this is kind of a funny description here. It talks about the people who work at the hotel lingering around his room. He's in the Concord room. Rooms have little names. And they say that when people come from London in the mail carriage to check into the Royal George, one kind of man is seen to go into the room, and all kinds of varieties of man come out. So consequently, another drawer and 2 porters and several maids are loitering around to see what Mr. Lorry likes when he comes out of the room. And then this is a description of Mr. Lorry. So he is 60, formally dressed in a brown suit of clothes, pretty well worn, but very well kept, with large square cuffs and large flaps to the pockets, passed along on his way to breakfast. So he's going to go eat, and he's dressed for the day. It describes what he's wearing here and just how methodical he is, how proper he is. It says he had a good leg and was a little vain of it, for his brown stockings fitted sleek and close and were of a fine texture. His shoes and buckles, too, though plain, were trim. So this is describing not only the quality of his stockings, or his socks, basically, and his shoes, but also that he's strong. He's not like some frail older man. He has some muscle tone left, and so he's proud that he looks healthy. He wore an odd little sleek, crisp flaxen wig very close to the head, which was presumed to be made of hair, but which looked far more as though it were spun from filaments of silk or glass. So he has a very nice wig, and he has a linen suit. And then it describes his face, which is habitually suppressed and quieted, but it's lighted up under the quaint wig by a pair of moist, bright eyes that it must have cost their owner in years gone by some pains to drill to the composed and reserved expression of Tellson's Bank. So what we can infer from this is that Mr. Lorry is sentimental that he's emotional, but because he works for the bank, he keeps himself very pulled together. He is also not married. As he's sitting waiting for his breakfast, he falls asleep because, of course, he didn't sleep very much the night before. And but then he wakes up when his breakfast comes, and he tells the server that he's prepared for a young lady who may be arriving later, and that she's going to be asking for him and to please let him know when she arrives. And then the man recognizes that, oh, you're with Tellson's Bank, and they sort of talk some more about the bank. So these kind of scenes just reinforce for us as a reader that Tellson's is a big deal. You know, this is like a big bank. They have a French house and an English one. Tellson's and Company has a branch in London and in Paris. And then Mr. Lorry says that he has not gone back and forth between London and Paris for 15 years. He said it's been 15 years since we, so there's a hint, him and who else came last from France. And indeed, sir, that was before my time, before our people's time. The George was in other hands at that time. So like there's a new owner since the last time he was there. And so he just says, you know, it feels like it was ages ago. More than 15 years ago is what it feels like to Mr. Lorry. And then after Mr. Lorry eats, he goes out for a walk along the beach. There's an interesting description here. The little narrow crooked town of Dover hid itself away from the beach and ran its head into the chalk cliffs like a marine ostrich. So ostriches, when they feel threatened or powerless, hide their head in the sand. So this sort of, you know, creates a personality for Dover itself as a place that might feel powerless and that it needs to hide itself away. We have a little, like a marine ostrich as a simile. It goes on to talk about how rough the water is, how smelly it is. Just everything smells like fish. And it does say here, a little fishing was done in the port and a quantity of strolling about by night and looking seaward, particularly at those times when the tide made and was near flood. Small tradesmen who did no business whatsoever, so this means they're not real businessmen, sometimes unaccountably realized large fortunes, and it was remarkable that nobody in the neighborhood could endure a lamplighter. So that means that a lot of the people in Dover are smugglers. They're moving things back and forth from France to England, and they don't like the lamplighter because obviously it's easier to be a criminal in the dark than it is to be when the streets are lit. So the day moves into the afternoon, and Mr. Lorry's thoughts start to feel clouded. He starts to worry again. He's imagining digging. His mind is digging. He's just anxious. He's anxious for what's going to happen next. So he goes to dinner, and it does say here, a bottle of good claret after dinner does a digger in the red coals no harm. So he's dealing with his anxiety by drinking an entire bottle of wine. Claret is not as strong as typical wine, but it's still a full bottle. So he's got himself much more relaxed by the time Miss Manette arrives. So here's Miss Manette. She's the woman who is coming to meet him. This is who he's supposed to be waiting for. And she wants to see him right away. So he's so nervous. He says he has nothing to do but to finish the glass of the wine he has and go to her apartment, which is basically her hotel room. And ominously, it's furnished in a very creepy way. It's very dark. All the furniture is black, dark tables, like almost blackened wood. The chairs have like horsehair covering on them. There's even a reference to like as if they were buried in deep graves of black mahogany. That's how he feels in that room, like he's buried, because it's just so dark. And so then we get introduced to Miss Manette. So she's a young lady of not more than 17 in a riding cloak and still holding her straw traveling hat by its ribbon in her hand. As his eyes rested on a short, slight, pretty figure, a quantity of golden hair, a pair of blue eyes that met his own with an inquiring look, and a forehead with a singular capacity, remembering how young and smooth it was, of rifting and knitting itself into an expression that was not quite one of perplexity or wonder or alarm or merely of a bright fixed attention, though it included all the four expressions. As his eyes rested on these things, a sudden vivid likeness passed before him of a child whom he had held in his arms on the passage across that very channel one cold time when the hail drifted heavily and the sea ran high. Okay, so he knows her. He remembers her as a child. Even here, remembering how young and smooth it was. So they have met before, and it's when she was very small. Then there's a reference here to like a picture that's behind her of a procession of Negro cupids, several headless and all cripples, offering black baskets to dead sea fruit, to black divinities of the feminine gender, and he made his formal bow to Miss Manette. So his eyes, after he's thinking about how beautiful she is and how he remembers her as a child, sees this picture, this sort of tribal picture behind her, and it's kind of creepy, and it makes him even more uncomfortable. But then she says, please sit down, and they sit down to start talking, and Mr. Lorry kisses her hand in a very formal way. And she says, I received this letter from the bank telling me that there was some intelligence or some discovery. And then she says, respecting the small property of my poor father, whom I never saw so long dead. So she's saying that she received a note that she was to come and meet Mr. Lorry because there's some news of some property that belonged to her father who has been dead for a long time. That's what she understands. So they kind of talk around this a little bit here because he's afraid to tell her. So she keeps just sort of walking through what happened on her end. She says, I replied to the bank, sir, that as it was considered necessary by those who know and who were so kind as to advise me that I should go to France, and that as I am an orphan and have no friend who could go with me, I should esteem it highly if I might be permitted to place myself during the journey under that worthy gentleman's protection. So that worthy gentleman is Mr. Lorry. So just make a note to yourself that Miss Manette is an orphan. She has no one who can go with her to France to collect this property of her father, and that Mr. Lorry is the man who's going to accompany her. And Mr. Lorry says, I was happy to be entrusted with that charge. I shall be more than happy to execute it. And then she says, it was told to me by the bank that the gentleman would explain to me the details of the business and that I must prepare myself to find them of a surprising nature. I have done my best to prepare myself. And she's eager to know what they are. So she's kind of talking about Mr. Lorry like in the third person instead of saying like, you would explain to me. She's like, the man will tell me, what it is. She's trying to get him to tell her, what is it that has been found that belongs to her dead father. And Mr. Lorry says, it is very difficult to begin. So he did not begin because he's so nervous. But in his indecision, he meets her gaze and he looks at her. And the young forehead lifted itself into that singular expression, but it was pretty and characteristic besides being singular, and she raised her hand as if with an involuntary action she caught at or stayed some passing shadow, and she says, are you quite a stranger to me, sir? Well, I think we can infer at this point, no. He knows who she is. Am I not? Mr. Lorry opened his hands and extended them outwards with an argumentative smile, like he won't even tell her. Between the eyebrows and just over the little feminine nose, the line of which was as delicate and fine as it was possible to be, the expression deepened itself as she took her seat thoughtfully. So she knows. This is someone she probably has known from her past. So Mr. Lorry says, in your adopted country, I presume, I cannot do better than address you as a young English lady, Miss Manette. So what he's referring to here is that she lives in England, which is her adopted country, but given her name, Manette is French. She is French originally. So here, there's a really cute exchange. Mr. Lorry is just trying to remind himself at every single second that he is a businessman and that he has a business responsibility because he's like the leader of the bank. And he says to her, I'm a man of business. I have a business charge to acquit myself of. Just pretend I am a machine the way I am talking to you. This is just information. These are facts. He says customers, which obviously she to some degree must be. We call our connections customers. He was a French gentleman, a scientific gentleman, a man of great acquirements, a doctor. So there's a customer that Mr. Lorry had who was a doctor, a French man, not a Bouvet, which is where she's from originally. Why, yes, a Bouvet, like Monsieur Manette, your father. Okay, so there's a connection here. Obviously, I think we can infer he's talking about her father. The gentleman was a Bouvet, like Monsieur Manette, your father. The gentleman was of repute in Paris. I had the honor of knowing him there. Our relations were business relations, but confidential. I was at that time in our French house, meaning the French branch of the bank, and it had been, 20 years. Okay, so 20 years ago, Mr. Lorry was in Paris working for Tellson's in Paris. Think about this. Miss Manette is 17 years old at this point. The last time Mr. Lorry went back and forth between France and England would have been 15 years ago. So I'm just going to tell you, Mr. Lorry came with Miss Manette when she was 2 years old. He brought her from France to England. I'm just going to make that connection. I think that will be helpful to you. He goes on to talk about the fact that this doctor married an English lady, and he says that he was one of the trustees. So as the bank, they put their money with the bank, and they probably put some of that money in a trust. His affairs, like the affairs of many other French gentlemen and French families, were entirely in Tellson's hands. In a similar way, I have been the trustee of one kind or another for scores of customers. These are mere business relations, nothing like sentiment. He's trying so hard not to let his emotions get the best of him. Clearly, he says, I have no feelings. I am a mere machine. This is not true. He has feelings. He definitely has feelings for her. He's sentimental about what has happened to her. And Miss Manette says, this is my father's story, sir. Yes, indeed it is. Because she says, when I was left an orphan through my mother surviving my father by only 2 years, it was you who brought me to England, and I am almost sure it was. Now, I really do question this. I mean, I'm sure as a 2-year-old, she doesn't remember, but she's putting it together, as we are, honestly, just through these connections here. So this is the truth. And he says, yes, Miss Manette, it was I, and you will see how truly I spoke of myself just now in saying I had no feelings and that all the relations I hold with my fellow creatures are business relations. When you reflect that I have never seen you since, no, you have been the ward of Tellson's house since, and I have been busy with other business of Tellson's house since. Feelings, I have no time for them, no chance of them. I pass my whole life, miss, in turning an immense pecuniary mangle. Okay, so he's just pointing out to her that he's been professional. The money that belonged to her parents is in Tellson's bank, and he has been making that money available to her for her care since that time. But he does not interact with them as a family at all. I mean, he's never seen her until this moment. So he knows his boundaries, and this is what he is declaring here. So then we get this bit of news. He says, so far, miss, as you have remarked, this is a story of your regretted father. Now comes the difference. If your father had not died when he did, Of course, this scares her. Oh my God, what are you about to tell me? And Mr. Lorry says, pray, control your agitation. As I was saying, if Monsieur Manette had not died, if he had suddenly and silently disappeared, if he had been spirited away, if it had not been difficult to guess to what dreadful place, though no art could trace him, if he had an enemy in some compatriot who could exercise a privilege that I in my own time have known the boldest people afraid to speak of in a whisper, across the water there, he's pointing towards France, for instance, the privilege of filling up bank forms for the consignment of anyone to the oblivion of a prison for any length of time, if his wife had implored the king, the queen, and the court and the clergy for any tidings of him, and all quite in vain, then the history of your father would have been the history of this unfortunate gentleman, the Doctor of Beauvais. So he's still talking in circles. He won't come right out and tell her that her father was put in prison and no one ever heard from him again. And so he says, I will tell you more. He says that now, if this doctor's wife, though a lady of great courage and spirit, had suffered so intensely from this cause before her little child was born, the little child was a daughter, sir. Okay, so just piece this together. The doctor's wife is so upset about not knowing where her husband is, and she's pregnant with a child who is Miss Manette, a daughter. Yes, don't be distressed, miss. If the poor lady had suffered so intensely before her little child was born that she came to the determination of sparing the poor child the inheritance of any part of the agony she had known the pains of, by rearing her in the belief that her father was dead. Oh my goodness, Miss Manette. Oh, for the truth, oh dear God, oh dear good compassionate sir, for the truth. So because the mother had suffered so much not knowing where the father was, she raised her daughter, Miss Manette, by just saying the father had died, because the uncertainty of not knowing where he is, would have been so much more painful. So, yes, it's finally acknowledged that your mother took this course with you, and when she died, I believe brokenhearted, having never slackened her unavailing search for your father, she left you at 2 years old to grow to be blooming, beautiful, and happy, without the dark cloud upon you of living in uncertainty, whether your father soon wore his heart out in prison or wasted there many lingering years. So when Miss Manette was 2 years old, her mother died brokenhearted, and this is when Mr. Lorry brought her back to England. So he goes on to clarify, there has been no new discovery of money or property, but he has been found. He is alive. I mean, oh my gosh, what a goosebump moment. Your father has been taken to the house of an old servant in Paris, and we are going there. I to identify him if I can, you to restore him to life, love, duty, rest, and comfort. So they are going to go get her father, who has been found alive. So this whole reference to digging someone out of a grave, he has been, just no one knows where he's been. He's been just gone, imprisoned, and no one ever knew if he was alive or dead or anything. And now here he is, and he's been in prison for, just under 20 years. It's a long time. So obviously Miss Manette is very shook by this. A shiver runs through her. She's awe-stricken. She says, I'm going to see his ghost. It will be a ghost, not him. Like, she just can't even imagine. This whole time she thought he was dead. And he tries to calm her down. And she says, I have been free. I have been happy, yet his ghost has never haunted me. So she has been so innocent to this whole time. And now she has to sort of change her whole sense of reality. And then Mr. Lorry says, he has been found under another name, his own, long forgotten or long concealed. So he is emotionally and psychologically, her father, very broken. So they're going to go and get him, it's best to say here, again, we have secrets. Secrets again, better not to mention the subject anywhere or in any way, and to remove him for a while at all events out of France. Even I, safe as an Englishman, and even Tellson's, important as they are to French credit, avoid all naming of the matter. I carry about me not a scrap of writing openly referring to it. This is Secret Service. My credentials, entries, and memoranda are all comprehended in the one line, recalled to life. So recalled to life is a code phrase that indicates that they're talking about getting Dr. Manette out of France, but he's telling Miss Manette that she cannot say anything about what they're doing. So things in France are very unstable, as we will learn. So she falls back in her chair. She's in shock, as you can imagine. And then all of a sudden, in comes this woman. A woman comes bursting into the hotel room, a wild-looking woman whom, even in his agitation, Mr. Lorry observed to be all of a red color and have red hair, and to be dressed in some extraordinary tight-fitting fashion, and to have on her head a most wonderful bonnet like a grenadier wooden measure, and good measure too, or a great Stilton cheese, came running into the room in advance of the inn servants. And she pushes aside Mr. Lorry and sends him flying against the nearest wall. And Mr. Lorry thinks, oh my gosh, this must be a man. And she just yells, why, look at you all, bawled this figure, addressing the inn servants. Why don't you go and fetch things instead of standing there staring at me? Go and get, smelling salts and cold water and vinegar. So she runs to Miss Manette and lays her down on the couch and says, oh, my precious, my bird, and spreads her hair aside and helps her to relax. And she yells at Mr. Lorry, couldn't you tell her what you had to tell her without frightening her to death? Look at her with her pretty pale face and her cold hands. Do you call that being a banker? So she really yells at him. So this is her nanny. We'll get her name later. But he does say to her, I hope that you'll be accompanying Miss Manette to France. A likely thing too, replied the strong woman. If it was never intended that I should go across salt water, do you suppose Providence would have cast my lot on an island? And this is something that Mr. Lorry also cannot answer. So here are some important details in this chapter. Mr. Lorry has arrived at Dover. He's staying at the Royal George Hotel. Miss Manette meets him there, and we find out that her father is alive in France, and they're going to secretly bring him back to England.